What I really want to know is, just how involved was Sid Meier in the development of Sid Meier's Civilization 6? He's gotta be more than just a name on the box. He's still working at his 20-year-old company and still keeping watch over this 25-year-old franchise. In a recent Eurogamer interview, he talked about how he didn't have solid ideas even for Civilization 2 back in the day. So the way it works is that the concept of Civ keeps getting handed off to new blood. New design teams add their own spin on the same game with the sequels. This time, the torch has been passed to board game champion turned board game designer turned Civilization savior, Ed Beach. Hiring top talent from board gaming makes a whole lot of sense for this series, not just because Civ plays kind of like a really complicated board game, but Civ doesn't have a story or continuity to maintain. Each new installment is basically a set of new rules plus a graphics update, and at no other point in the series has the process of these rule changes been more apparent than here at number 6, where video game graphics have stopped evolving and now the update just is rule changes. Despite the leader models looking more alien than ever, the level of individual asset detail here is at, or maybe even slightly below, the 6-year-old Civ 5. Presumably to clean up the visual mess and release an optimized game for once, but it looks fine, really. They kinda use the switch in style to cram way more animated parts into the frame. Remember how in Civ 4 they played a pre-rendered movie of wonders getting constructed from the ground up? Now it happens in real time on your actual map, beautifully blending into the cities and buildings you placed yourself that all look organic but distinct together. And that's neat. What's much more neat is just how smooth and elegant they managed to make a very complex Civ sequel play. The style and graphics may be reminiscent of Civ 5, but that might be because Civ 6 feels kinda like a Civ 5 do-over, taking the good ideas of the previous game's expansions and not chickening away from their overwhelming complexity as the vanilla, original, unpatched, and unexpanded launch version of Civ 5 did. So you've got a hex grid that can only hold 1 unit per hex, religious pantheons and beliefs that raise an alternate currency that can purchase entire armies and buildings. You've got trade routes that are actual units that uncover terrain that can overwhelm other civs with your genes and pop music and museum exhibits and tourists, to almost the point where a review of Civ 6 is going to sound an awful lot like a review for Civ 5 Brave New World. Which does make a whole lot of sense. Ed Beach was the lead designer on the Civ 5 expansions too. So optimizing all of the previous expansion systems down into a new installment gives Civ an opportunity to try risky new ideas while still having a lot of safety nets to fall back on. Risky idea number 1 is that builders can no longer build roads. They're consumable this time, they're used up just after 3 builds, so getting your roads down is now done by traders who build wealth at the same time as roads, and both those changes are indirectly tied to an effort to throttle military aggression, partly by how gosh darn long it takes to march troops into lands without trade routes, but also by increasing the consequences of military aggression with those limited builds, having to recruit new builders to repair pillaged improvements, only to use them up before you have to recruit new builders again, cripples the economies of warring nations in a way that was only implied before. Couple that with an AI ready to offer entire cities as part of peace treaties, and you have a lot of measures to make wars play faster and end sooner, but hit harder. Risky idea number 2 is that 2 new economic caps replace your global happiness meter from the last game. Amenities and housing regularly stop you from expanding too far, just like happiness used to do. Except these are measured on a per-city basis rather than for your entire empire, and they're also much more easily satisfied. So without a global happiness meter and more aggressive barbarians out there in the wilds, you have more encouragement to expand and explore, which is good because expanding and exploring is fun. Risky idea number 3 is that the diplomatic victory and its world government election is, it's just kind of missing. Until I noticed just how much more robust and enjoyable they made the religious victory and kind of ended up considering that as a replacement. My Japanese Shinto theocracy ended up conquering the world, not by airlifting out armies of soldiers, but rather missionaries. They were engaging in something called theological combat, where 2 opposing missionaries just kind of call down bolts of lightning on each other until one of them dies. I guess the implication here is that they're debating until one of them just decides to give up and retire, I guess? That's a hell of a stretch, but hey, it works for the game. It's something to do while pursuing a peacetime playstyle, which was the big problem that Brave New World so beautifully fixed for the culture victory, and this installment is especially good at keeping those peacetime playstyles interesting. But really, all of the above, all those risky ideas are just subtle tweaks compared to the big game changer. For the past decade, it seems like every new mainline Civ was designed around a mad determination, sometimes to a fault, of fixing a ridiculous quirk of the previous game. Civ 4 gave us unit strength to prevent spearmen from beating tanks, Civ 5 gave us 1 unit per tile to prevent overpowering doom stacks from dominating the game, and Civ 6 gives us risky idea number 4. Districts, to prevent the entire map from turning into farmlands that players swapped in and out of as needed. Districts act as plots that the more specialized buildings for your cities end up at, and they take up a whole tile on the map permanently. Forever. You can't delete them later on, and boy does that pile on the pressure. Wonders take up entire tiles too, so as a result you have a lot of adjacency bonuses being tossed around that amplify the effects of buildings and improvements placed next to each other. It's designed to get you to care about your real estate, and it really works. That Japanese Shinto theocracy may have succeeded because I made them become nature-loving environmentalists, because if I demolished all this rainforest in the early game, then their shrines would have lost their rainforest adjacency bonuses. So you really have to take advantage of the environment in this one, because you're making much more permanent changes to it. But with all that new pressure comes extra options for new playstyles than before. And the process of figuring out how I needed to play by coming to understand the real estate available to me was kind of beautifully evocative of the real-life history that Civ has always tried so hard to celebrate. This is a history-spanning strategy game where the locations of your earliest battles become historical artifacts to be dug up and rediscovered 10, if not 20 hours later. I was finding Viking artifacts on a continent they hadn't even existed on for thousands of years. The Norwegian civilization still existed in 1939 as a people with their big burly Viking mascot, but they were now in a time and place so far from their history that there was a kind of beauty in discovering that the game's systems remembered their story. The game's process of creating the player's own history doesn't forget the player's own history. I mean, sure, that whole thing with the artifacts is a system rolled over almost verbatim from Brave New World, but damn is it a good-ass system! However, what's always been an unfortunate surprise for the improvements Civ 5 brought about is that a lot of them aren't really compatible with good AI. At this point, it seems like computers will never have even a basic grasp over 1 unit per tile tactics. But now those computer leaders have hidden agendas and ideological priorities that can conflict with their more practical priorities in ways that just break them. In another game, Japan here declared war on me for no reason at all, with no units and no plan of attack, so 3 years later he just asks for peace. And then France does the same thing before Japan chimed in 2 turns later to make fun of me for being in debt when, come on, man, I'm making $8 a day, I'm doing fine. Which is really a problem of interface affluence. Players wouldn't notice how bonkers the AI is if they didn't make so many unskippable pop-up messages telling you how bonkers their AI is going. A similar issue is that social policies are now called civics, and they're an entire separate research tree to chuggle around, and at this point, I'm ready to say that this whole tree is a bit much. Especially since most of what you're researching here are small passive bonuses that you'll never slot into your government. They tend to fall into one of 2 camps, boosting military production or boosting economic production, so this whole system might make more sense if you're swapping in and out of short little wars like I think Firaxis wants you to be doing, but the diplomatic warmongering penalty is still just as heavy as it was in the last game. So if you're trying for a pacifist playstyle, you're not going to be doing a whole lot with what you research here. It reminds me a lot of the way vanilla Civ 4 handled religion. It's easily ignorable, but not quite as easy to ignore. There are mega milestones along the way that do suddenly explode into real change, but the process of getting there just isn't gratifying. The whole civics tree just doesn't feel like the slow, cumulative drip feed of improvements like every other progression process in the game does. But it still pops up with nagging messages all the damn time, just like the AI leaders wonking out, and in the later games so too do your cities nag you to death. which is really unfortunate and kinda kills the mood for just how much better the late game is in this one. With all of these Brave New World culture mechanics to play with, there's really never a dull moment at the end. You're either suffering in some kind of horrifying modern warfare where you're selling blue jeans and curating museums or calling down bolts of lightning. Man, there's always something happening out there, it's nutso. Considering how just 6 years ago the end game was this never-ending process of saying yeah, whatever to the AI advisor, it seems like a real accomplishment that they've made the late game feel as unpredictable and consequential as the early game. There's a lot of active player involvement needed, and it's streamlined into a set of decisions that aren't nearly the cluster of late-game civs of old. But while that's happening, every one of your old trade routes will ask for some place to go, and at that point you're going to have a lot of trade routes. Every city will ask for something to produce, and you can't tell them to just invest in science or whatever and stop bothering you. The tech and civic trees don't top out either. In fact, the civic tree made me keep inventing Facebook over and over again. Don't know if that's a glitch or just a weak attempt at giving you another thing to click on. Which is what 90% of this game is so good at, giving the player meaningful, impactful decisions to mull over again and again and again. And for the late game interface to confuse that with meaningless buttons to click on again and again and again is kind of a shame. Because I think this is the strongest vanilla Civ yet. The question is, how long will it take them to polish and expand it up into one of the strongest strategy games yet? If you haven't enjoyed the fully expanded Civ 5, you can't go wrong here. If you have, it might feel like you've been there and done that, but without all of the bloat, a lot of the systems here make a whole lot more sense. But over the next year, it wouldn't surprise me to see expansions revive up the dead diplomacy victory and rework the civic system. Of course, the interface is surely going to get some spit shining. People are also finding exploit strategies all over the place, but I mean really, the most offensive oversight here to me was how you can't rename all your cities to Poop Town. That's only about as bad as it gets.